Slave was sort of like the youngest side of the Dayton movement.
They had it all: chart-topping funk anthems, a distinct sound that made them stand out in the late 70s and early 80s, and a lead singer whose voice was impossible to forget. But behind the success of Slave lay a story of tension, power struggles, and tragic losses that would ultimately tear them apart. How did Steve Arrington's leadership lead to divisions within the band? What happened to the group after his controversial departure? And how did Slave's legacy get overshadowed by internal conflicts, financial disputes, and heartbreaking deaths? This is the tragic story of Slave and Steve Arrington. The story of Slave begins in 1975 in Dayton, Ohio, a city that was practically a breeding ground for some of the best funk bands of the era. Groups like the Ohio Players and Zapp had already made their mark, setting a high bar for musicians coming out of the region. Funk was in the air, and a group of young, hungry musicians wanted to make their own name in the industry. At the heart of Slave were two incredibly talented musicians, bassist Mark Adams and guitarist Danny Webster.
So we would had this local band together with some other people, but we were all in sixth period together, music class, with Danny Webster, who was the guitarist from Slave, and also Mark Hicks, the guitarist from Slave. So we all would be in sixth period jamming together.
They had a raw, energetic style that was all about deep, driving bass lines and funky guitar riffs. Alongside them was Steve Washington, a key creative force who helped shape the band's overall sound and direction. The group had a powerful chemistry, and their music stood out because it was built on heavy grooves and a tight rhythm section. In the early days, Slave had a rotating lineup of musicians, but everything changed when Steve Arrington joined. At first, he was just the drummer, laying down infectious beats that made their songs impossible not to dance to. But as time went on, something became very clear. Arrington had an incredible voice. His smooth yet powerful falsetto had a way of cutting through the music and giving Slave a whole new level of soul. Eventually, he moved from the drums to center stage, becoming the lead vocalist. This shift took the band to a whole new level. By the late 70s, Slave was on fire. They released back-to-back albums that cemented their reputation as one of the best funk bands of their time. Their self-titled debut album, Slave, made waves, followed by Hardness of the World and Stone Jam. These albums weren't just good. They were packed with funk anthems that people still play today. Some of their biggest hits included Watching You, Slide, and Just a Touch of Love. These songs became instant classics, filling dance floors and getting constant radio play. The combination of Adams' deep, thumping bass, Webster's funky guitar licks, and Arrington's unmistakable vocals made Slave one of the most exciting bands of the era. Their music had a raw, energetic quality that made it feel alive, and their grooves were so infectious that even people who didn't know much about funk couldn't resist moving to their beat. But while everything seemed perfect on the surface, cracks were already starting to form behind the scenes. As Slave's popularity grew, so did tensions within the band. Creative differences, power struggles, and conflicts over leadership were bubbling beneath the surface, and it wouldn't be long before these issues would come to a head. For any band, success brings more than just fame and fortune. It also brings pressure, egos, and creative struggles. Slave was no exception. While they were producing some of the most iconic funk music of their time, tensions were growing within the group, and at the center of much of the conflict was Steve Arrington. Arrington wasn't just another member of Slave. His voice became the band's signature sound. When he first joined as a drummer, no one expected that he would eventually take center stage. But once his falsetto started dominating tracks, fans took notice. His vocals gave Slave a fresh, soulful edge that made their music instantly recognizable. Songs like Just a Touch of Love and Watching You showed how much of an impact his presence had. But But while fans were loving it, not everyone within the band was happy with this shift. Slave was originally built as a collective effort, where every musician had an important role. The band's identity wasn't supposed to revolve around one person. Some members began feeling like their contributions were being overshadowed, and the more Arrington took the spotlight, the more those tensions grew. One of the biggest struggles within Slave was deciding who was in charge. As Steve Arrington's influence grew, he wasn't just becoming the face of the band. He was also gaining more control over the music. He had strong opinions about where the band should go creatively, but not everyone agreed with his vision. Arrington was heavily inspired by jazz and experimental sounds, and he wanted to push Slave's music in that direction. However, the band had built its name on funk, hard-hitting, groove-heavy tracks that made people dance. Some members felt that shifting their style too much would take away what made Slave special in the first place. This led to constant debates, with different members pushing for different sounds. As Arrington took on a bigger role, his voice started shaping the band's music in a way that some members weren't comfortable with. He had a strong presence in songwriting and production, and some bandmates felt like Slave was turning into his project rather than a collective effort. This shift created tension, especially among members who had been there from the start. Slave was originally built on the idea that every musician had an equal part in their success. But now, with Arrington becoming the star of the group, some bandmates felt like they were being pushed to the side. This created a divide between those who supported his growing leadership and those who felt that the band was losing its original essence. By 1980, after the release of Stone Jam, these internal struggles reached a breaking point. Several key members, including Steve Washington, Starlina Young, and Kurt Jones, decided to leave the band and form their own group, Aura. Their departure wasn't just a minor shakeup. These were some of Slave's most important contributors, and losing them meant the band had to completely rethink its identity. Aura went on to find success on their own, but Slave was left trying to hold on to the magic that had made them famous. With such an important part of their lineup gone, Slave faced an identity crisis. The band had always been built on collaboration, but now they had to figure out how to keep making music without some of their strongest musicians. Fans noticed the difference, and some felt that the group wasn't the same anymore. Slave brought in new members to fill the gaps, but finding the right chemistry again proved to be a challenge. Every time a major band member leaves, it creates instability, and Slave was no exception. They had to redefine their sound while still trying to stay true to what made them successful in the first place. Even though the band kept going, this period of change was difficult. The tensions that had led to the split didn't completely disappear, and Slave had to work hard to regain their footing. The loss of key members marked the beginning of a challenging time for the group, forcing them to adapt while still holding on to the core of their music. This period of transition was tough, but the internal struggles weren't over yet. Beyond the clashes between band members, they also faced significant issues with their record label, Cotillion Records. Like many artists, Slave found themselves caught between their creative ambitions and the commercial expectations of the music industry. While Steve Arrington wanted to experiment with new sounds and push the band's music in different directions, the label was more focused on producing marketable hits that would appeal to mainstream audiences. This led to constant tension, as the executives at Cotillion wanted Slave to stick to a formula that guaranteed commercial success, while Arrington and some other members wanted more artistic freedom. One of the biggest points of contention was deciding which songs would be released as singles and how albums should be structured. The label often pushed for radio-friendly tracks, while Arrington wanted to explore more complex, jazz-inspired sounds. These disagreements weren't just frustrating, they made it increasingly difficult for the band to function smoothly. Every decision became a battle, and with multiple voices fighting for control, the creative process suffered. At the same time, the band was also dealing with financial issues, which only made things worse. Like many groups of their era, Slave faced royalty disputes and struggled with mismanagement of their earnings. The money they were making wasn't always being distributed fairly, which created even more resentment among the members. As these pressures mounted, it became clear that something had to change. Arrington, feeling trapped by both the band's internal conflicts and the limitations imposed by the industry, realized that he couldn't continue under these conditions. In 1982, he made the difficult decision to leave Slave and pursue a solo career. His departure was a huge blow to the band, as his unique voice had become one of their defining features. Without him, Slave had to restructure yet again, struggling to maintain their identity while navigating an increasingly competitive music landscape. After leaving Slave, Steve Arrington launched his solo career with the release of Steve Arrington's Hall of Fame The Har in 1983. His signature track, Weak at the Knees, became an instant classic, later influencing generations of hip-hop artists who frequently sampled its funky beat. While Arrington found success as a solo artist, his departure left Slave in a difficult position. The band struggled to find a stable lead vocalist who could fill the gap he left behind, and the constant lineup changes made it hard for them to maintain their original sound and energy. As the mid to late 80s rolled in, the music industry was rapidly changing. Funk was no longer dominating the charts the way it had in the 70s, and genres like hip-hop, new jack swing, and electronic music were taking over. Slave had a hard time adapting to these shifts, and their later albums didn't reach the same level of success as their earlier work. Without Arrington's distinctive voice and creative input, their sound felt less cohesive, and they struggled to stay relevant in an industry that was moving forward without them. Meanwhile, Arrington faced his own set of challenges as a solo artist. While he had more creative control over his music, navigating the industry without the backing of a band came with its own pressures. He continued to make music, but the landscape of funk had changed, making it harder to sustain long-term success. Though he remained a respected figure in the genre, neither Arrington nor Slave would ever fully recapture the peak of their early years together. Meanwhile, over the years, Slave faced more than just leadership disputes and lineup changes. The band also experienced deep struggles that left lasting scars, both within the group and among their fans. While internal conflicts played a major role in shaping Slave's history, the tragedies that followed would become even more devastating. As the years went on, the funk world had to say goodbye to several key members of the band, marking the slow and painful end of an era. One of the biggest losses was bassist Mark Adams, who passed away on March 5, 2011, at the age of 51. Adams was a driving force behind Slave's signature sound, laying down the deep, infectious bass lines that made their music so unforgettable. His passing was a huge blow to fans and former bandmates alike. Just a few months later, another tragedy struck when guitarist Mark "Drac" Hicks died on June 14, 2011, at the age of 52. Hicks had been a key part of the band's energy and creativity, and his loss only deepened the wounds left by Adams' passing. The heartbreak didn't stop there. In 2020, the band lost two more members, singer and guitarist Danny Webster and saxophonist Orion Wilhoit. Webster, who had played an important role in shaping the band's later sound, passed away on September 10th at the age of 61. Wilhoit, a talented saxophonist who had contributed to the band's funk-driven energy, died on March 20th at the age of 63. These deaths sent shockwaves through the funk community, reminding fans of just how much time had passed since Slave's peak years. Then, in 2023, two more key members of the band were lost. Keyboardist Carter Bradley passed away on February 21st at the age of 73, and just a few weeks later, drummer Roger Parker died on March 5th at 67. By this point, many of the original members who had helped shape Slave's iconic sound were gone, leaving fans mourning not just the musicians themselves, but also the era they represented. But the tragedy surrounding Slave didn't stop with the loss of their founding members. As the years went on, the band also struggled with deep internal conflicts, financial mismanagement, and the ever-changing music industry, all of which contributed to their decline. While the deaths of Mark Adams, Drac Hicks, Danny Webster, Orion Will Hoyt, Carter Bradley, and Roger Parker marked the end of an era for Slave, the cracks in the foundation had been forming long before. Behind the scenes, tensions were running high, and former member Wayne Foote later revealed just how difficult things had become. According to Foote, Slave's management imposed a grueling rehearsal schedule, forcing the band to practice up to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. While this level of discipline may have contributed to their tight sound, it also drained the members physically and mentally. Instead of fostering unity, it created resentment. Band members began to feel like they were being treated more like workers than artists, which only worsened their frustrations over money. Many felt they weren't being properly compensated for their contributions, especially considering the success of Slave's music. Their albums were selling, their concerts were packed, and their influence was undeniable. But the financial rewards weren't reaching everyone in the group equally. The issue of money became one of the most divisive topics within Slave. Several members believed they were underpaid and undercredited, which led to increasing tensions with management and each other. Some felt that only a select few were benefiting financially, while others struggled to make ends meet despite their hard work. These financial disputes added to the existing stress, making it harder for the band to function as a unit. The situation worsened due to conflicts between individual members, particularly between guitarist Mark Drac Hicks and singer-guitarist Danny Webster. The two reportedly had ongoing disagreements, creating even more tension within an already fragile group. With financial issues and internal conflicts weighing them down, Slave also had to face another major challenge: the changing music industry. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, funk was no longer at the forefront of popular music. The rise of hip-hop, new jack swing, and other emerging genres pushed funk to the sidelines. While Slave had been a dominant force in the late 70s and early 80s, their sound was beginning to feel outdated in a market that was evolving rapidly. Even though their earlier work remained highly influential, especially among hip-hop producers, Slave itself struggled to maintain relevance. Ironically, while the band itself was fading from the mainstream, their music was becoming more popular than ever in a different way. Hip-hop artists were heavily sampling Slave's catalog, incorporating their signature grooves into some of the biggest rap songs of the era. Tracks like Dr. Dre's Gin and Juice and NWA's Gangsta Gangsta borrowed directly from Slave's funk foundation, keeping their legacy alive in a new musical landscape. However, like many early funk artists, Slave didn't always receive proper credit or financial compensation for the use of their work. While younger generations were dancing to the beats of Slave's music, the band itself remained in the shadows, unable to benefit from its renewed popularity. For a group that had once been at the top of the funk world, watching their music take off in hip-hop while struggling to stay afloat must have been a bitter pill to swallow. The combination of internal disputes, financial struggles, and industry shifts made it nearly impossible for Slave to reclaim their former glory. As key members left or passed away, the band's identity became harder to define, and their attempts to adapt to new trends didn't gain much traction. For fans, the downfall of Slave was heartbreaking. They had built a legacy as one of the most innovative funk bands of their time, yet behind the scenes, They were dealing with battles that ultimately led to their undoing. But despite all the hardships, Slave's influence on funk and R&B is undeniable. Their grooves became the foundation for hip-hop classics, proving that their music had a lasting impact. As for Steve Arrington, he took a step back from the music industry in the 90s to focus on his spiritual journey. After years of shaping the funk landscape with his unique voice and rhythm, he felt a calling beyond the stage and studio. He chose to dedicate himself to a different path, one centered on faith and personal growth, stepping away from the fast-paced world of music.
I then made a career change, and while away from the music scene, many sampled my music.
For a while, it seemed like he had left it all behind, but his love for music never truly faded. Even in his absence, his influence remained strong, with countless hip-hop artists sampling his work and keeping his legacy alive. Years later, Arrington found his way back to music, but this time, he wasn't chasing mainstream success. Instead, he re-entered the industry on his own terms, reconnecting with the essence of funk while collaborating with a new generation of artists who admired his work. He teamed up with modern funk revivalist Dom Funk and even worked with hip-hop legend Snoop Dogg.
Now we have an album with Steve Arrington, the most revered lead singer of one of the best funk groups that ever came out, coming on his label, and I'm producing it. It's just crazy how things come full circle.
Proving that his sound was timeless. His return wasn't just about nostalgia, it was about evolution. Arrington embraced the changes in the industry, blending his classic funk roots with contemporary styles, showing that true artistry never fades. His journey from being a funk pioneer to a solo star, then stepping away only to return with a renewed creative purpose, speaks to his resilience and passion. He never allowed himself to be boxed in by industry expectations, choosing instead to follow his own path. Even after decades in the business, his music continues to resonate with fans old and new, proving that great artists don't just fade away, they adapt, grow, and inspire. While the story of Slave is filled with both triumph and tragedy, their music remains immortal. Despite the internal conflicts, financial disputes, and heartbreaking losses of key members, their legacy stands strong. Their grooves continue to be celebrated, sampled, and enjoyed by generations who appreciate the power of funk. And with Steve Arrington's enduring presence in music, the spirit of Slave lives on. Though the band itself may no longer be together, their influence remains undeniable, proving once again that true funk never dies. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.